The confession came out of her like a splinter finally worked free from skin, painful, involuntary, and leaving something raw in its wake. "I never learned how to ask for help," Alma Keene said, her voice barely above the roar of the wind that tore across the Nevada flatlands and rattled the brittle wood of the sheriff's office door. Theodore Walker did not flinch. He did not look surprised. He did not offer the kind of hollow consolation she had braced herself against. He simply looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, the kind that had always made her feel like he could see straight through the layers of stubbornness she wore like armor, and he said, "I know. I watched you." 3 words, and somehow they undid her entirely. She had spent the last 4 years being the woman who did not falter, the woman who hauled her own water, fixed her own fences, buried her own grief. She had learned to read a deed of claim and argue it in front of a county judge. She had learned to fire a Colt single-action Army revolver with enough accuracy to make outlaws reconsider their life choices. She had not cried when her father died. She had not screamed when her land was threatened. She had not asked a single living soul for a single thing, because asking felt like surrender, and surrender felt like dying. And this man, this infuriating, patient, perceptive man, had watched all of it. Every refusal, every white-knuckled moment of going it alone. He had watched, and he had understood, and he had waited. The storm outside was building. The kind of Nevada storm that rolled in from the Sierra Nevada range without warning, swallowing the sky in purple and gray, turning the dry earth into something that smelled like the world was being reborn. It mirrored everything happening inside of Alma Keene right then, which she found deeply unfair. "You should have said something," she told him. "Would you have listened?" She opened her mouth, closed it. The truth sat between them like a loaded weapon, and they both knew she had no good answer for it. Theodore Walker leaned back against the rough-hewn desk, folded his arms, and let the silence do what silence always did between them, stretched it until it was something you could feel against your skin. "Sit down, Alma," he said quietly. And for the first time in 4 years, she did exactly what someone asked her to do. It had started the way most things in Alara County. Nevada started in the year 1878, with dust and desperation, and a secret that someone should have told sooner. Alma Keene had arrived in the town of Caldwell Crossing with a wagon that had lost a wheel 3 miles outside of town, a dead horse, and a land deed her father had pressed into her hands the morning before he died of a fever that took him faster than any of them had expected. She was 26 years old, with copper-red hair that had come loose from every pin she tried to use, a smear of wagon axle grease on her jaw, and the kind of expression that discouraged casual conversation. She had walked those 3 miles into town pulling a canvas bag over one shoulder, carrying a wooden box with her father's most important papers under her other arm, and refusing absolutely to look as desperate as she felt. Caldwell Crossing was a town of approximately 400 souls in the autumn of 1878. It sat at the confluence of 2 dry creek beds that flooded spectacularly in spring, had one church, one saloon, one hotel that also functioned as a dentist's office on Tuesdays, a general store, a telegraph office, and a sheriff's office that was staffed by a man named Theodore Walker, who was 29 years old, recently appointed, and who was standing outside his office watching her walk down the main street when she arrived. She had not looked at him then. She had looked at the general store, calculated the distance, decided she needed water and a feed assessment before she decided anything else, and walked straight past him without acknowledgement. He had watched her go, and somewhere in that watching, something had shifted for him that he would not fully understand for a long time. The land deed Alma carried was for 40 acres east of town, along the base of a ridge the locals called Coffin Ridge, because of the way the rock formations lined up when the light hit them at sunset. The land had been purchased by her father, Garrett Keene, 12 years prior, when the area had been barely a settlement. He had paid for it with money he'd scraped together working cattle drives across 3 states, and he had held onto that deed like a promise to a future, he never quite managed to reach. Garrett Keene had been a kind man and a tired one, and he had died at 51 years old in a rented room in Reno, having never broken a single acre of that land. His one regret, he told Alma the morning before the fever took him completely, was that he hadn't gone sooner, that he'd been afraid of starting over. Alma had held his hand and told him she wasn't. That had been a partial truth, which was the only kind she permitted herself. She spent the first week in Caldwell Crossing at the hotel, which cost her 17 cents a night, and included a breakfast of salt pork and biscuits that she ate standing up, because sitting at a table with strangers required a kind of social navigation she didn't have the energy for. She walked her land every morning before the heat rose, measuring it in her steps, studying the soil, looking at the creek bed that ran along the eastern boundary, and planning for what it would be in spring. She kept to herself. She was efficient and brief in her transactions at the general store. She nodded at people but did not invite conversation. She was, from the outside, the most self-contained human being in Alara County. Theodore Walker noticed her the way you notice a fire in a cold room, unavoidably, and with a warmth that caught him somewhat off guard. He was not a man given to impulse. He had taken the sheriff's appointment after spending 4 years as a deputy, and before that, 2 years working as a ranch hand out of Carson City, and before that, a childhood in Missouri that had taught him the value of steady work and the danger of rushing toward things. He was methodical. He was observant. He was, according to his deputy Hank Briggs, the most patient man in the state of Nevada, which Hank did not mean as a compliment. He did not approach Alma Keene in that first week. He watched her move through the town the way you watch whether something consequential was coming, and the best thing to do was understand its patterns before you stepped outside into it. On the 8th day, the trouble started. A man named Orville Cass rode into Caldwell Crossing with 3 companions, and a piece of paper he claimed was a competing deed to the 40 acres on Coffin Ridge. Orville Cass was 43, broad-shouldered with small eyes and the kind of smile that never quite reached them. He had money from cattle and more from a silver speculation that had gone better than most, and he had decided that the land along Coffin Ridge sat in exactly the right position to control water access for the eastern grazing fields he was expanding into. He came to the hotel first. He knocked on Alma's door at 7 in the morning and offered her $200 for the land. Alma, who had been awake for 2 hours already reviewing her father's papers, opened the door, looked at him, looked at the money he was holding out, and said, "No." He raised it to 300. She said, "The door will be closing now." She shut it. She heard him standing in the hall for a moment, and then his footsteps, heavy and deliberate, retreating down the stairs. She returned to her father's papers and spent the next hour reviewing every document twice, making sure every piece was in order, because something in those small eyes of Orville Cass had told her that this was not over, and she had not survived 26 years of hard living by ignoring what her instincts told her. By noon, she had heard from the woman who ran the hotel laundry, a sharp-tongued woman named Pearl Duggan, who told Alma everything she needed to know about Caldwell Crossing in the manner of a person who had been waiting their entire life for someone willing to listen, that Orville Cass had been to see Judge Alderton that morning, that he had presented papers, that there was going to be a formal hearing. Alma ate her salt pork and biscuits and processed this information. She needed a lawyer. She had no money for a lawyer. She needed to understand local water law and land registry procedure. She had no guide for either. She needed, for the first time since her father's death, to ask someone for something, and the very thought of it felt like putting her hand into a fire. She went to the land registry office first and requested copies of the filing records herself. The clerk, a nervous young man named Albert who seemed terrified of her directness, provided them. She spent the afternoon at the corner table of the hotel lobby, reading through registration procedures by the light of a tallow candle, and taking notes in the margins of the newspaper she'd been using to wrap her boots for the journey. She did not ask Theodore Walker for help. Theodore Walker found out about the hearing from Judge Alderton himself, who stopped by the sheriff's office that afternoon to notify him that there was a potential land dispute developing. Alderton was cautious. He told Theodore that Cass had a deed, that it appeared to predate Garrett Keene's claim, and that he had concerns about the validity of the competing document, but that his hands were tied until the formal proceeding. Theodore asked when the hearing was scheduled. 2 weeks, Alderton said. October 14, 1878. Theodore asked if the woman holding the Keene deed had legal representation. Alderton paused, looked uncomfortable, said he did not believe she did. Theodore walked out of that office, stood in the street for a moment watching a dust devil spiral across the road in front of the livery, and thought about Alma Keene reviewing documents alone in a hotel room and refusing to ask anyone for directions even when she was clearly lost, and he made a decision. He did not go to her room. He did not interrupt her work. He went to the telegraph office and sent a wire to his old law school acquaintance in Carson City, a man named Bennett Price who had quit law for cattle and then come back to law when the cattle went badly, asking him to come to Caldwell Crossing as a favor. He did it quietly. He did not tell Alma. He knew, with the particular kind of knowledge that comes from careful observation, that if he offered her help directly she would decline it, and that the offer might even push her away from the only resource she actually needed. It was perhaps the most significant thing about Theodore Walker in those early days. He understood the architecture of pride. The days leading up to the hearing were a series of small, accumulating discoveries for Alma. She found inconsistencies in the Cass deed herself, a surveyor's signature that appeared to be the same hand as the notarization, which was technically improper. She found a gap in the chain of title that suggested the original seller may have already sold the rights to the mineral claims separately. She was building a case, brick by careful brick, in complete isolation. She was also exhausted. She was sleeping 4 hours a night. She had bags under her eyes that Pearl Duggan commented on with the directness of someone who felt personal ownership over the well-being of anyone who had listened to her gossip. She had stopped eating the breakfast because the social effort of walking into the common room had begun to exceed her available energy. She was surviving on jerky she'd bought at the general store and coffee so strong it made her hands shake slightly by mid-morning. She was, by every objective measure, struggling, and she did not say a word about it to anyone. Theodore Walker brought Bennett Price to Caldwell Crossing on October 9th, 5 days before the hearing. He introduced him as a friend passing through. He arranged for Bennett to happen to be in the hotel common room at the same time. Alma came down for coffee on the morning of October 10th. Bennett Price was a broad, easy-mannered man with a laugh like rolling gravel and no talent for subtlety whatsoever, and the plan nearly failed spectacularly when Bennett saw Alma's note spread across the corner table and said immediately, "That's land registry analysis. You're the woman with the Coffin Ridge claim, aren't you?" Alma looked at him with the expression of someone preparing to be sold something. Bennett sat down across from her without invitation, which was either bold or oblivious, and with Bennett it was usually both, and said, "I'm a lawyer. I've done 3 land disputes in Alara County, and I know Judge Alderton's rulings backward. Your surveyor signature problem is good, but it won't be enough on its own." Alma was silent for a moment. "I didn't ask for your assessment," she said. "I know you didn't," Bennett said cheerfully. "But you've been awake since before dawn working on this alone, and the hearing is in 5 days, and that Cass deed has a predate on it that is going to be Alderton's first question. So do you want to have this conversation or not?" Another silence. She looked down at her papers, up at him. The exhaustion in her face was something profound and real, a tiredness that went beyond sleep deprivation and into the particular hollowness of someone who had been carrying weight alone for too long. "What do you want for it?" she asked. "Coffee," Bennett said. "I take it with a great deal of sugar." She did not smile, but something in the set of her jaw released, fractionally, like a door settling off its latch. "Fine," she said. It was the closest she could come to "thank you." Theodore Walker, who had watched the entire exchange from the doorway of the common room while pretending to examine the notice board for wanted posters, allowed himself a quiet exhale. Over the next 5 days, Bennett Price took her case apart and rebuilt it. He identified the predate issue and found a solution in the county filing records. Garrett Keene had filed a preliminary survey intent in 1867, nearly a year before the earliest possible date on the Cass deed, which pushed the question of original claim back significantly. He coached Alma on how to present herself before Alderton. He taught her the procedural language that would frame her arguments correctly. She was a remarkable student. Bennett told Theodore privately on the evening of October 12th that she was the sharpest client he'd ever had, and the most impossible. "She won't let me help with the easy things," he said. "I offered to carry her files to the registry office, and she looked at me like I'd suggested she dance in the street." "She'll carry her own files," Theodore said. "You know her." Theodore considered this. "Not yet," he said. The hearing on October 14th lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Judge Alderton was a severe man with a reputation for thorough procedure, and he questioned both parties with the relentlessness of someone who had been cheated twice in his own life and had never forgotten it. Orville Cass presented his deed with confidence, and his lawyer presented precedents with polish. Alma Keene stood before the judge's bench in her clean dress. She had two, and this was the better of them, with her papers organized in a leather case she had borrowed from the hotel proprietor, and she laid out her case with the precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment. The preliminary survey intent filed in 1867 was, Bennett had told her, their strongest argument. She presented it last, saving it the way a good card player saves their best hand, and watched Alderton's eyebrows rise as he read through it. Cass's lawyer objected. Alderton overruled him. The ruling came 30 minutes later. The Keene deed was valid. The Cass deed, Alderton found, had irregularities in the notarization that rendered it procedurally suspect. He dismissed the challenge and recorded the Keene claim officially in the county register. Alma stood very still when the ruling was read. She thanked Bennett with a handshake that was firm and brief, and Bennett, who had learned enough about her in 5 days to understand what that handshake cost her, accepted it with matching brevity and told her she'd won it herself. She walked out of the courthouse into the October afternoon light of Caldwell Crossing and stood on the street for a moment, and then she sat down on the steps, which was not a thing she ever did, and she pressed her hands to her knees and breathed. Theodore Walker, who had been standing across the street, did not cross to her immediately. He let her have the moment. Then he crossed the street, climbed the 2 steps of the courthouse, and sat down beside her, not so close as to intrude. Close enough to be present, she did not look at him. "You knew him before," she said. "Price, you brought him." It was not a question. "Yes," Theodore said, more silence. A horse went by on the street below them. The sun was at the angle that turned the Nevada dusk golden. "Why?" she said. He thought about a number of answers, chose the honest one, "Because you were going to lose otherwise." "I might have found the survey intent on my own." "Maybe, but in 5 days alone, while running on no sleep and jerky." She turned and looked at him then, and the look on her face was a complicated architecture, anger and relief, and something more vulnerable than either, something she was already beginning to wall back up. "I don't need," she started. "I know," he said. "I wasn't trying to take anything from you. I was trying to make sure you didn't lose the thing you'd already earned." The vulnerability shifted, the anger dimmed. "You could have told me," she said. "Would you have let me help?" The silence answered. "I'll repay you for his fee," she said. "Whatever you paid him. He came as a favor, no fee. I'll repay you for his travel then." "Alma." He said her name quietly, and something about the simplicity of it stopped her. "Let someone do something for you, just once. You can go back to doing everything alone tomorrow." She looked at him for a long moment. The October light was doing something remarkable to the street around them, filling it with amber and shadow, and somewhere in that light, Alma Keene made a very small, very private decision that she would not have admitted to making for a long time after. "Thank you," she said. It sounded like it hurt. "You're welcome," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The weeks that followed were the beginning of something she did not name for herself for a long time, because naming it felt like acknowledging a need, and acknowledging a need felt like the very thing she had spent her adult life learning not to do. She began breaking ground on Coffin Ridge in late October, when the worst of the summer heat had left the soil. The work was enormous for one person. She had bought a mule from a rancher south of town, a stubborn, enormous animal she named Patience with deep irony, and she had borrowed a plow frame from the livery, and she worked from first light to failing light every day, coming into town for provisions and leaving again before she could be drawn into conversation. Theodore Walker began passing her property on his morning rounds. This was partly official. The county sheriff rode the district roads as a matter of course, checking on outlying properties, responding to reports, ensuring the general order that a growing settlement needed. It was entirely legitimate. It was also, Theodore acknowledged to himself in the privacy of his own honesty, not accidental timing. He would pass in the morning and see her at the plow. He would pass in the late afternoon and see her mending fence line. Once he stopped because a wheel on her borrowed plow frame had cracked, and she was in the process of trying to wedge it back into serviceable function with a piece of scrap metal and what appeared to be pure willpower. He dismounted and fixed it properly in 10 minutes with tools from his saddlebag. She watched him do it without speaking. When he was done, she said, "Thank you," and it came a little more easily than it had on the courthouse steps. He mounted up and rode on. He did not linger. He did not push for conversation. He understood, in the way he understood most things about her by then, that the kindness had to be proportional enough to register, not so much that it threatened her sense of self-sufficiency. She thought about him that evening. This was not the first time, but it was the first time she let herself think about him without immediately redirecting her mind toward something practical. He was 30 years old to her 26, which she found neither remarkable nor concerning. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a quality of stillness that was unusual in men his age, most of whom she had found to be either too loud or too eager for approval. He was neither. He seemed, as far as she could tell, entirely comfortable with himself, and comfortable with silence, and comfortable with her, which was the most unusual thing of all, because most people found her difficult. She had been told she was difficult by her father's friends, who thought a young woman ought to soften her edges for better prospects. By a man she had nearly agreed to marry in Reno 3 years ago, who had wanted a partner in the legal sense and a dependent in the practical one, and who had been genuinely bewildered when she declined to arrange herself accordingly. She had ended that association before it reached the formal stage and had not particularly regretted it, except in the lonely hours at 3 in the morning, which she did not count because 3 in the morning was not a reliable narrator. Theodore Walker did not find her difficult, or if he did, he found it interesting rather than inconvenient. In November, Orville Cass began a different kind of pressure. He could not touch the land legally anymore. The county record was clear. But he could make life difficult in the ways that money and influence permitted in a small frontier town in 1878. He began making it known that he was not purchasing livestock from anyone who sold to Alma Keene. He had a friendship with the owner of the general store that suddenly manifested in a significant markup on the supplies she needed most. Her mail began arriving opened and carelessly resealed. She noticed all of it. She said nothing. She solved each problem individually and in silence. She went to a rancher 20 miles east to buy a heifer she needed, paying the extra travel cost without complaint. She began ordering certain supplies from a catalog company in San Francisco, which cost more but bypassed the general store entirely. She started collecting her mail herself from the telegraph office instead of the store where it was usually sorted. She was a woman who could solve problems alone. This was not in question. But the accumulated weight of it, the constant low-level siege, began to show in the set of her shoulders, in the sharpness of her voice on the rare occasions she spoke with anyone in town. Theodore saw it. In mid-November, he arrested Orville Cass on a separate matter entirely, a legitimate complaint filed by a rancher named Gomez whose fence line had been cut by someone in Cass's employ. It was a real crime and a real arrest, and Cass spent 2 days in the county jail before posting bond. But the arrest sent a message that Theodore intended, which was that the law in Alara County was not Orville Cass's personal instrument. He did not tell Alma he had made the arrest in partial response to what Cass was doing to her. He did not need her to know it. But after the arrest, the mail stopped being opened. The general store prices reverted to normal. The pressure eased. She came into town on the Thursday following and stopped in front of his office, where he was sitting on the bench outside reviewing a report. Gomez's fence complaint, she said. He looked up. That was real, she said. The complaint, but it was also something else. He did not insult her intelligence by denying it. Yes. She stood there for a moment. The November wind was cold now, and she had her coat buttoned to the throat, her copper hair caught back in a braid that had been neat this morning and was fighting its constraints by afternoon. I would have handled it, she said, but there was something in her voice that was different from the earlier declarations of independence. Something softer, not surrender. She was not built for surrender, but perhaps acknowledgement, that handling it alone had a cost and that someone else bearing some portion of that cost was not the same as weakness. I know you would have, he said. How's Patience? The pivot disarmed her, which he suspected was why he did it. Patience is a terrible mule, she said. Is she working? Barely. She has strong opinions about the direction of the plow rows. Mules generally do. She almost smiled. He could see it at the corner of her mouth, a slight upturn that she suppressed with the speed of long practice, but not quite fast enough. Alma, he said. Yes. Would you like to have dinner? There's nothing improper about it. Pearl Duggan will be in the common room and she'll report every detail to the entire town within the hour, so your reputation will be impeccable. The almost smile was back, stronger this time. That's a significant selling point, she said. I thought you'd appreciate it. She looked at him for a long moment. The calculation happening behind her eyes was visible if you knew how to look for it. He had learned to look for it. Risk assessment. Vulnerability analysis. The gap between what she wanted and what she thought was safe to take. 6 o'clock, she said. I'll be in from the property by then. She walked away, and Theodore Walker sat back against his bench and looked at the November sky and felt something in his chest that was quiet and certain, and had been building for weeks. Dinner was at the hotel, where Pearl Duggan had arranged the corner table near the window with what she claimed was absolutely no prior knowledge of any arrangements, and where the lamb stew was better than usual and the bread was fresh from the afternoon bake. They talked about her land plans. He asked questions that revealed he had a working knowledge of soil and climate that surprised her, and she found herself drawing diagrams on the edge of her napkin showing the drainage pattern she was planning for the spring flood season. He contributed a detail about the ridge's shadow line that she had not known, which would affect her growing season by 2 weeks. She looked at him with the expression of someone recalculating. How do you know that? She asked. I rode this territory as a deputy for 4 years before the appointment. I know this land. You like it here. I do. He looked at her steadily. Do you? She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, because she did not do anything carelessly. She thought about the morning light on the ridge and the way the soil smelled when she turned it, and the creek bed that would run full in spring, and the particular quality of quiet that existed on those 40 acres in the hour before sunrise. Yes, she said. I think I might. Good, he said, just that. Later, walking back from the hotel, he walked with her, keeping a correct distance, to the edge of town where the road turned east toward her property. She stopped at the junction and looked at the dark outline of Coffin Ridge against the night sky. "My father never came," she said. It was not addressed to him specifically. It was more as if something had simply risen to the surface and emerged. He bought that land and he was afraid to come to it. He worked other people's cattle and other people's land for 30 years and he never came to his own. Theodore was quiet. "He left it to me because he thought I wasn't afraid," she continued. "I don't know if that's true. I think maybe I just never learned to recognize fear as a reason to stop." He thought about what to say. He chose, as he often did, the simple truth. "That sounds like courage or stubbornness. Sometimes they're the same thing." She turned and looked at him in the dark, and something passed between them that was not yet named but was entirely real, like a current in that dry autumn air. "Good night, Theodore," she said. "Good night, Alma." He watched her walk down the road toward the ridge until she disappeared into the dark, and then he walked back to his office and sat for a long time with the lamp burning low, thinking about courage and stubbornness, and how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone else stand next to you. Winter in Alara County in 1878 was harder than usual. The cold came early and deep, turning the dry creek beds to ice and making the desert landscape a study in gray and white that was severe and beautiful in equal measure. Alma stayed on her property through most of it, which worried Pearl Duggan significantly, and which Alma herself considered simply practical. The work of the land did not stop because the weather was unpleasant. She had built herself a one-room sod house on the property's western edge, low to the ground and well-insulated, with a stove she had purchased with most of what remained of her father's savings. It was spare and functional and entirely her own, and she was prouder of it than she had been of most things in her life. Theodore came by officially twice during those winter months, once to check on outlying properties during a cold snap that concerned him for the welfare of settlers, and once on county business related to a grazing rights dispute on the ridge's northern face. Both visits were brief and correct. On the second one, the temperature had dropped to something dangerous, and she had not yet gotten her stove lit from the morning's banking, and he lit it without asking and was gone before she could formulate the objection. She let that one go without comment. In January, she received word from a distant cousin in Ohio, who had somehow located her through the county register, that there was a debt attached to her father's estate, a small one. A loan from a mining concern in Nevada that had preceded the land purchase, which had been sold to a collection firm. It was $62, which in January of 1879, after she had spent her reserves on the stove and the mule and the seed grain she needed for spring, was not a small thing. She went through her accounts at the table by lamplight that night and added everything twice, and the sum came out the same both times. She could delay the seed grain. She could plant later, which would reduce her yield, which would reduce her income, which would push next winter's reserves lower. It was manageable. It was just another problem that could be solved individually in silence by herself. She sat for a long time with the lamp burning. She thought about Theodore Walker. She thought about what it would mean to say, "I have a problem I cannot solve alone right now." She thought about how it would feel in her mouth. Like exposure, she thought. Like setting down armor in a field where you might still need it. She did not go to him. She planted late, and her yield in that first summer was lower than it would have been. She sold some to the grain merchant, kept some for her own reserves, and paid the debt in July with the last of it. She told no one. Theodore noticed the late planting. He did not comment on it directly. He asked in April, when he passed on his morning round, how her supply situation was coming into spring, and she said it was fine, and he accepted this with the particular silence of someone who knows they are being told a partial truth but understands why. Spring on Coffin Ridge, when it came, was something Alma had not been prepared for. The creek bed filled in March with snowmelt, exactly as she had planned for, and by April it was running clear and cold along her eastern boundary, and the soil she had broken the previous autumn came alive in a way that felt almost personal. Things she had planted with cold hands and uncertain hope were up. The pasture grass was coming in on the lower acres. The small kitchen garden beside the sod house was producing herbs and early greens that made her ordinary food taste, for the first time in months, like something worth eating for its own sake. She stood in the field one afternoon in late April and looked at what she had made the turned earth, the young crops, the fence line she had stretched herself post by post, and she felt something she did not have a good word for. Not happiness exactly, which she associated with lighter things. Something more like solidity, like the particular rightness of being exactly where you belong. Theodore came by that evening, end of his rounds, and he sat on the fence rail at the property edge the way he had sometimes begun to do, and she brought him coffee because she always made extra and there was no reason not to. And they sat in the April evening with the creek running its low sound behind them and talked about the planting. He told her about the grain merchant in Alma Crossing who gave better rates than the one in Caldwell, and she made note of it. She told him about the problem she was having with patience and a particular corner of the east field, and he suggested a technique with the harness that she tried the following morning and which worked. These were not large things. They were the ordinary exchange of two people who knew the same land and trusted each other's judgment. She realized somewhere in that spring that she had begun to trust him. It was not a small realization. Trust for Alma Keene was a geological process, the kind of thing that happened over years under pressure. It was not given. It was formed. She turned it over and looked at it, and it was solid. In May, Orville Cass made one more move. He had been quiet since the arrest in November, but quiet in the way that certain men are quiet. Not done, just reorganizing. He had discovered, apparently through the county assessor, that the $62 debt from January had existed, and that the estate had carried it. He had purchased the collection notice from the firm that held it, and he presented it to Alma in person, at the property line, on a Tuesday morning in early May. He was polite about it, professionally polite. He said the note was technically past the original due date, and that while he had no wish to cause difficulty, the terms required either immediate payment or negotiation. The note had been paid in July. She had the receipt. She looked at him and then went inside and retrieved the receipt from where it was stored with her other documents, neatly organized, everything in its correct place because she had never let herself be careless with paperwork, and she brought it back and handed it to him. His expression did not change. He looked at the receipt for a moment, nodded, folded it, and offered to return it. She said she had a copy. He could keep it. He rode away, and she watched him go, and she understood then that he was not going to stop, that his persistence was not about the land itself anymore, or the debt, or any specific grievance. It was about the fact that she existed here and had refused him, and that this was something he had decided he could not let stand. She thought carefully about what she was going to do. She went to Theodore that same afternoon. She had not sought him out before. In all of it, the winter difficulty, the late planting, the accumulated small pressures, she had always been the one to hold her ground alone. She found him outside the sheriff's office and said, "Do you have a few minutes?" He looked at her face, which told him enough before she said a word. "Come inside," he said. She told him about Cass's visit. She told him about the paid receipt. She told him that she believed this was not over and that she wanted to know what her legal options were in terms of formal harassment documentation. Because one thing the Bennett Price sessions had given her was an understanding of the procedural tools available to her, and she thought it was time to begin building a formal record. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "You're right. We start a file. Every incident dated and documented. If he comes onto your property again without cause, that's the beginning of something we can take to Alderton." She nodded. He picked up a pen and paper. "Tell me the full history, everything in order from November," she told him. All of it, the mail, the general store prices, the winter pressure, the debt note. He wrote it all down, asked clarifying questions, dated each entry. When she finished, he set the pen down and looked at her, and something in his expression was careful and quiet. "Why didn't you tell me about the winter?" he said. She was silent. "The debt, the late planting, you were in difficulty and you didn't say anything." "I managed it," she said. "I know you managed it." He paused. "That's not what I asked." The silence between them was different from the companionable silences they had learned to share. This one had something alive in it. "I don't know how to ask," she said, finally. It came out quietly. "I never learned how to ask for help." Theodore Walker put down the pen. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark, steady eyes that had learned the patterns of her the way a surveyor learns the lay of land. "I know," he said. "I watched you." The weight of those 3 words. She had expected sympathy or advice or, worst of all, pity. She had not expected to be seen. To have someone look at her most fundamental difficulty not as a flaw to be corrected or a vulnerability to be soothed, but as simply a thing that was true about her, that he had noticed, that he had understood. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. But something released in her chest, some tension she had been holding so long it had become structural, and without it the architecture of her shifted slightly. "It frightens me," she said. She had not planned to say it. It was another emergence, another thing that had risen from the deep water and surfaced without permission. "Asking," he said, "needing, depending on anyone." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What happened that made needing feel dangerous?" She thought about this. No one had ever asked it quite that way before. Not as an accusation or a curiosity or a social probe, but as a genuine question from someone who actually wanted to understand the architecture of her. "My mother left when I was 8, she said. "She had a harder life than she'd bargained for, and she made a different choice. I don't blame her for it. I understand it better now than I did. But I watched my father after that. He needed her and she was gone, and the need was still there, and there was nothing for it to land on. He carried it his whole life." She stopped. "I decided I wouldn't do that. So you decided not to need." "I decided not to show it. There's a difference." "I know," she said. "I know there's a difference." He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, looking at her with an attention that was not pressing, just present. "Alma, you walked 3 miles into this town pulling a canvas bag with axle grease on your face, and you've built something real on land that no one believed in. You are one of the most capable people I have ever watched work." He stopped, let a moment pass. "But capability isn't the same as not needing anything. And the fact that you can do things alone doesn't mean doing them alone is what's best." She looked at him for a long time. "You have spent a year watching me," she said. "Yes." "Why?" The question was direct and genuine, and deserved a direct and genuine answer. And Theodore Walker had always believed in answering direct questions directly. "Because from the first morning you walked into this town I thought you were remarkable, and I've spent the time since then becoming more sure of it." He held her gaze without flinching. "Because I think about you when you're not there. Because when you walked into this office just now, I felt something settle in me, like it does when a thing that's been missing comes back." He paused. "Because I'm in love with you, Alma, and I imagine you already know that." The air in the sheriff's office was very still. Outside, the May wind moved down the main street and turned the dust in slow circles. Somewhere down the block someone was hammering, the ordinary sounds of a frontier afternoon. Alma Keene sat across the desk from Theodore Walker and looked at him with an expression that he had never seen on her face before. Not the professional assessment, not the careful calculation. Something more naked and more real. Something that looked, if he was reading it correctly, and he had become very good at reading her, like the expression of someone who had been standing outside a door they wanted to open for a very long time, and who had just found someone willing to open it from the inside. "I know," she said softly, and he said, "And I'm terrified," she said, "and I think I have been since October." He stood up, walked around the desk. He did not rush it. He stood in front of her and offered his hand, not to take her somewhere, just to hold, just to give her something solid to hold onto if she wanted it. She looked at his hand, looked up at him. She took it. The warmth of it went through her like the first real warmth of spring going into cold ground, something deep and transforming and slow. "I don't know how to do this," she said. I always kept everything very separate. Work and feeling, and I know, he said. We'll be slow. I'm not going anywhere, Theodore. Yes. If I'm difficult, Alma, he said it gently. I've been watching you be difficult for a year. I'm still here. The almost smile came, and this time it completed itself. Full and real, and changing her whole face in a way that made him feel something so enormous and quiet he had no word for it in any language he knew. Summer of 1879 was the season in which Alma Keene learned, slowly and with enormous resistance and occasional backsliding, to let someone love her. It was not a smooth process. She still arrived at problems alone and had halfway solved them before she thought to mention them to Theodore. She still sometimes shut down entirely in the evenings after a difficult day on the land, going quiet in a way that was not personal, but that required him to understand the difference between closed off and wounded, which were two entirely different things that could look the same from the outside. He was patient in the way that only people who are genuinely certain of themselves can be patient. He did not take her silences as rejection. He did not need her to be available to him on a schedule. He came by when he came by, and when she was glad to see him, she showed it in the small, specific ways. She had fresh coffee that she'd put on when she saw him coming down the road, or a question about something she'd been thinking about that revealed she'd been saving it for him. There were evenings in June when they sat on the fence rail at the property edge and watched the desert sky do the particular thing it did in the long western evenings, turning color in sequences that felt like an argument for the existence of something beautiful in the world, and they talked about everything and nothing, and the quiet between the words was something she was learning to live in without armor. He kissed her for the first time on an evening in late June, when they had been sitting by the creek bed watching the last of the spring water run past, and she had been talking about her mother, and about the specific kind of grief that is not grief for a death, but for an absence that keeps recurring, the way a scar sometimes aches in weather. He had listened to all of it, and at the end, when she had gone quiet, he had turned and looked at her with an expression that was both tender and somehow matter-of-fact, as if loving her were simply a settled thing, already decided, and she had turned toward him, and it happened as naturally as breath. She thought afterward that she had expected it to feel like risk, like the moment before stepping off a ledge. Instead, it had felt like something she had been walking toward for a very long time finally being where it was supposed to be. She told him so. He laughed quietly, which was one of her favorite sounds she had recently discovered, a sound that lived low in his chest and wasn't given out lightly. "I've been ready for you to get here for months," he said. "Was I very slow?" "You were exactly as slow as you needed to be." The Cass situation resolved itself in August in a way that was simultaneously anticlimactic and deeply satisfying. Theodore's formal complaint file, which had grown through summer editions as Cass continued his low-grade campaign, a boundary dispute claim that collapsed immediately under examination, a water rights objection that had no legal basis, an attempt to purchase the adjacent parcel under a third-party name that Theodore identified through the county assessor, was presented to Judge Alderton, along with a signed statement from 3 other property holders who had experienced similar pressure from Cass operations. Alderton issued a formal warning and an injunction against harassment. It wasn't a dramatic courtroom confrontation. Cass's lawyer received the injunction by mail and Cass himself made no direct appearance, but the pressure stopped completely, and the cessation of it was something Alma felt in her body, like the removal of a stone she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing its weight. She came to Theodore's office the day the injunction was confirmed, and she stood in the doorway and said, "Thank you," cleanly, simply, without qualification, not as if it hurt. He looked up from his desk. "You're welcome." "I'm getting better at that," she said. "I noticed." She came inside and sat across from him in the way she had come to do when she wanted to talk, and they talked for an hour about the fall plans for the property, and about the grain prices, and about Pearl Duggan's vigorous campaign to have the hotel common room repainted in a color that was apparently causing significant disagreement with the proprietor, and about nothing consequential, and about everything. In September of 1879, a year after she had walked into Caldwell Crossing with axle grease on her face and a refusal to ask for directions, Alma Keene stood in the church at the east end of the main street and married Theodore Walker. Pearl Duggan cried comprehensively and audibly. Bennett Price attended from Carson City and gave a toast that was too long and very funny. The rancher Gomez and his wife were there, and the hotel proprietor, and Albert the nervous registry clerk who had grown significantly less nervous in the past year, and Hank Briggs the deputy who had worked with Theodore for 4 years, and who seemed somewhat overwhelmed to be witnessing his unflappable boss get married. Alma wore a dress she had made herself over the previous 3 months from fabric she had ordered from San Francisco, a practical woman's concession to something more than practicality, a blue-gray the color of the Nevada sky in early morning. She wore her copper hair down for the first time Theodore had seen it free of its braid or its pins, and the sight of it stopped him mid-breath in the way she occasionally still stopped him, which was something he had decided he never wanted to stop. She stood in front of the minister with her hands in his and said her vows with the directness she brought to everything, clearly, without embellishment, and with her eyes on his the entire time. "I love you," she told him the night before in the September dark outside the sod house that she was going to have to start calling something else now. "I want you to know I mean it fully. It isn't complicated on my side. It's just true." "I know," he said. "You always say that," she said, "because with you I generally do." She leaned into him, which was still new enough to feel like something she was choosing actively, and he put his arm around her and they stood in the Nevada night with the stars doing what stars did out here, excessive and brilliant, burning in that dry air with no humidity to soften them. "I'm glad you walked into town that day," he said. "With the axle grease," she said. "With the axle grease. It was very appealing." "Theodore, I'm serious. It said everything about you immediately," she laughed. Her laugh was not frequent, and it was not decorative. It was the laugh of someone who found things genuinely funny rather than socially expected to, and he loved it precisely because of that. They moved Theodore into the property in October, which required an addition to the sod house that they built together over 2 weekends. He was handy with construction in the way that 4 years of ranching produces, methodical and efficient, with a particular technique for laying sod that he had learned from a homesteader in Wyoming, and that Alma watched once and then modified to suit their specific soil composition, which he found entirely characteristic and somewhat hilarious. He had a horse named Collins, a dark bay gelding with an excellent disposition, and a particular dislike of hats, and Collins joined Patience in the small paddock at the western edge of the property, and the 2 animals' relationship was an extended negotiation that required monitoring. They worked the fall harvest together, and the difference in what could be accomplished with 2 people rather than one was something that filled Alma with an emotion she was still learning to receive without deflecting. Not just the practical efficiency, though that was real and significant, but the simple fact of company in the work, of having someone to hand something to, of turning in the field and finding someone there. One evening in late October, working the last of the harvest by lamplight, she stopped in the middle of what she was doing and looked at him across the space of the barn and said simply, "I'm glad you're here." He looked up. The lamp made warm gold of the shadows between them. "I know," he said. "You're doing it again," she said, "knowing things, saying I know when I tell you something. It's true. I know it's true. It just—" She stopped, thought about it. "It makes me feel known," she said, "when you say it." He set down what he was holding and crossed the barn to her and stood in front of her and put his hands on either side of her face, tilting it up toward him, and looked at her with the expression that still, after months, could reach the places she had spent years walling off. "Good," he said, "because you are known. All the way down, Alma, I know all of you." She had nothing to say to that. She kissed him instead, which was more eloquent anyway. Winter of 1879 through spring of 1880 was the quietest, fullest stretch of Alma's life thus far. The Cass problem was resolved. The land was productive. She had filed a claim on an additional 15 acres of adjacent land that the county had made available for homestead application, and between her original 40 and the new claim, they were building something real and substantial. She had begun to think in years, not just surviving this season but planning for the next one and the one after. She and Theodore had developed a particular rhythm of partnership that balanced her independence with his steadiness, in a way that neither had designed deliberately, but that had emerged naturally from who they both were. She still preferred to solve her own problems first. He still watched with the patient attention that she had first found unsettling and had come to find the most secure thing she had ever known. But the isolation that had characterized her first year was gone, replaced by something that was both freer and more rooted. She told him things now. Not always immediately. Sometimes she sat with them first, sorted them in the private way that was still her nature, but she told them. The 3 in the morning thoughts that had previously had nowhere to land. The fears that lived beneath the competence. The grief about her father that she had not allowed herself to fully feel until now, when the land he had bought and never come to was producing real things, was growing real things, was becoming something he would have recognized and been proud of. She told Theodore about that grief one March evening quietly, and he listened to all of it, and at the end he said, "He'd have been proud of you," and she let herself receive that without deflecting, which was its own kind of hard-won thing. In April of 1880, she discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she told Theodore, not because she was afraid of his response, but because she was processing it, which was simply her nature, to turn large things over completely before she brought them to anyone else. She examined her feelings about it the way she examined her fields after a hard rain, looking for the real condition beneath the surface disturbance. What she found, beneath the shock and the practical calculation about timing and resources, was something she had not entirely expected, something warm and solid and certain. She told him on a Thursday evening in April when they were sitting on the porch addition he had built onto the east side of the house. The sod house had grown considerably over the past months, becoming something that deserved the word home. She said, "There's something I need to tell you." He looked at her. The particular quality of those words from her, with that expression, made him set down his coffee. "I'm pregnant," she said. And then, with the self-awareness she had developed about her own patterns, "I've known for 3 days. I needed to think it through first." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "And what did you think?" "That I'm glad," she said, "that we have enough. That I didn't expect to be this glad." He reached over and took her hand. Her hands had been strong and were roughened from the first day he had seen them, and they remained so, hands that had plowed and fenced and built and documented and argued and refused to surrender. He loved her hands. "I'm glad too," he said, "very glad." "I need you to know I'll still work," she said. "The property, Alma. I'm not going to become someone who can't work because I know," he said. "I wasn't going to suggest it." She stopped, looked at him, the reflexive defense dissolving because it had no target. "I know you're not," she said. "I was defending against something that wasn't coming." Old habit," she agreed. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a quiet and specific tenderness. "We'll do it like we do everything else," he said. "Together, at your pace, you tell me what you need." "That's still the hardest part," she said, "telling people what I need. I know you can practice on me. You make it sound simple." "It gets simpler," he said. "Every time you do it and nothing falls apart, it gets a little simpler." She leaned her head onto his shoulder, which was one of the private gestures she permitted herself. The ones she did not perform for anyone else, only for him, only in the specific safety of what they had built. "I need you to stay," she said. "That's what I need." "I'm staying," he said. "That was decided a long time ago." Benjamin Walker was born on the 23rd of December, 1880, in the home on Coffin Ridge with the assistance of the town doctor, a steady man named Dr. Calloway who had seen enough births in rough conditions to be entirely unflappable, and Pearl Duggan, who had appointed herself attendant and support, and who cried more than everyone else in the room combined. Theodore held his son for the first time standing near the east window of their home, in the early winter light, and the expression on his face was one Alma would carry with her for the rest of her life. Something enormous and quiet and completely unguarded. She watched him from where she lay against the pillow, tired in a way that went to the bone, and said, "He has your coloring. He has your chin," Theodore said without looking up from the baby. "Lord help him," Pearl Duggan said, which was affectionate. "Benjamin," Alma said, trying the name. They had agreed on it weeks ago, her father's middle name, but hearing it applied to the actual living weight of the child felt different from the agreeing. "Benjamin," Theodore repeated softly, as if confirming something. The baby, who had no opinions about names but strong opinions about the temperature change from the blanket to the air, made his feelings known and was quickly returned to the blanket and to his mother. Theodore came and sat beside the bed and looked at them both with the particular expression of a man whose world has recently expanded in ways he had not entirely anticipated. "Are you all right?" he said to her. "I'm exhausted, and I have a very strong opinion about what I am going to eat when I am capable of eating again," she said. "But yes, I'm all right. Tell me what you need." She looked at him. The winter light was soft through the window, and Pearl Duggan was tactfully occupying herself elsewhere in the room, and the baby was quiet, and outside the Nevada winter was doing its cold and silent work. "Stay next to me for a while," she said. "Yes," he said. The years that followed were the years that Alma Keene, Alma Walker, now, though she kept Keene in professional and legal documents as a matter of habit and identity, had not known how to let herself imagine during the years she had spent being only capable and only independent and only fine. They were not smooth years. The frontier was not kind to smooth. In 1881, there was a drought that cut their yield nearly in half and required a significant recalibration of their plans. In 1882, Collins, the horse, had to be put down following an injury, which affected Theodore more than he initially let anyone see, and which Alma, paying attention the way he had taught her to by example, noticed and sat with him through without trying to fix or minimize. "It's all right to be sad about it," she told him, in what she recognized with some private humor was an inversion of everything he had spent years teaching her. He looked at her sideways. He had noticed the inversion too. "You've learned things," he said. "I had a patient teacher," she said. In 1883, they expanded the operation significantly, bringing on a young hired hand named Lewis, the son of the rancher Gomez, who was 20 years old and tireless, and had a particular gift with livestock that made patients older now, and arguably even more opinionated, behave with unprecedented cooperation. The property had grown from the original 40 acres to over 90 by then, the homestead claim having been confirmed, and they had moved from crops alone into a mixed operation that included cattle and horses. Theodore had, in 1882, not stood for reappointment as sheriff. It had been a considered decision, made over several months, as the demands of the growing property made it clear that he was needed on the land more than he was needed in the office. He had recommended Hank Briggs for the appointment, which Hank received with the expression of a man who was simultaneously honored and certain he was going to regret it. The work of the land suited Theodore. He had always been more at ease in open space than in the procedural world of law enforcement, and the skills he had carried, his attention, his patience, his ability to understand systems, translated directly to land management in ways that complemented Alma's foundational knowledge and relentless drive. They were a remarkable partnership. People in Caldwell Crossing and the wider Alara County territory said so without reservation. Not because they were easy together. They were not always easy. They were too strong-willed and too specific in their natures to be easy, but because they were real together. Because they argued with respect and resolved with honesty and built things that lasted. Benjamin turned 3 in December of 1883 and was, By every assessment, a formidably willful child with his mother's copper hair and his father's patience-breaking dark eyes, and a capacity for mischief that appeared to have been inherited from no discernible source. He had learned to walk at 11 months, which Dr. Calloway said was early, and had been somewhere he wasn't supposed to be approximately 40% of the time since then. Alma loved him with a fierceness that sometimes startled her by its intensity. She had not known she was capable of this particular feeling. It was nothing like the love she had allowed herself to feel for the land, or even the love for Theodore, which was chosen and built and architectural. This was foundational, tectonic, the kind of love that lived under everything else and had no conditions. She told Theodore this one evening when Benjamin had finally been got to bed after an elaborate negotiation involving 3 stories and a glass of water and a philosophical discussion about whether the dark made sounds. "I didn't know," she said. "Know what? That I could feel something this enormous. I thought I had a limited range." He looked at her with something between amusement and deep tenderness. "You never had a limited range. You had a limited number of things you trusted enough to feel it toward. Are you still being insufferably wise at me?" "Probably," he said. "Is it less insufferable when you love me?" "Marginally," she said. She leaned against him on the porch in the December night, the cold of the Nevada winter doing nothing to diminish the warmth between them, and they listened to the quiet of the land they had made together. "I want another one," she said. "Eventually." "Tell me when," he said. "That is still very strange, having someone to tell. You'll get used to it." "I don't know. I think I might always find it a little strange, just not frightening anymore." "That seems like enough," he said. Their second child was a daughter, born in the spring of 1885, whom they named Clara after no one in particular, and everyone who had ever been brave. She had her father's dark coloring and her mother's chin, and an equanimity from her earliest weeks that suggested she had arrived knowing something the rest of the family was still working out. Benjamin, at 4.5, accepted her with the pragmatism of a child who had been prepared, and then looked at her in her cradle and said, with some significance, "She's very small," and then went back to his previous occupation. The family was a full and noisy and productive one. The property, Walker's Ridge, it had come to be called by the county, though Alma sometimes privately still thought of it as Coffin Ridge, the name her father had left her, was among the most prosperous in the valley by the mid-1880s. They had a real house by then, a timber-framed house Theodore had largely built himself over the course of a summer, with 4 rooms and a proper kitchen, and a porch that ran the full length of the south face and caught the best of the afternoon light. In 1886, Pearl Duggan sold the hotel and bought a small cottage at the edge of town, and began growing the most enthusiastic kitchen garden in Alara County, and telling everyone everything about everyone with great affection and no malice whatsoever. She remained one of Alma's closest connections in town, which surprised people who had met them both and noted the apparent contrast. But Pearl understood Alma in the particular way that direct people often understand each other, completely, without the soft focus that other people sometimes applied. In 1887, a young woman arrived in Caldwell Crossing under circumstances that bore some echo of Alma's own arrival 9 years prior. Her name was Martha Lund. She was 23 years old, and she had come from Kansas with a letter from a cousin who had promised work that did not materialize. She had no money and no immediate prospects, and the particular expression of someone who would rather die than ask for help. Alma saw her in the general store on a Wednesday afternoon, pricing things and putting them back, and recognized something she knew deeply. She stood next to her in the store and said, without preamble, "Are you looking for work?" Martha looked at her with the expression of someone bracing for a trap. "The Gomez Ranch 3 miles south is looking for someone to manage their accounts," Alma said. "Rancher Gomez's wife keeps the books, but she's needed on the property management side now and they're behind on their tallying. Can you do accounts?" Martha blinked. "Yes." "Good, I'll take you out tomorrow morning. You can stay at our property tonight. We have room." Martha opened her mouth to say something that was probably the beginning of a refusal. "I'm not offering it to be kind," Alma said, which was partially a lie but a useful one. "I'm offering it because it saves me a trip to town tomorrow and it's on my way anyway. Do you want the room or not?" Martha closed her mouth. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." Walking back to where Theodore waited with the wagon, Alma said to him quietly, "She's too proud to ask and too tired not to accept." Theodore looked at her with the particular expression that combined knowing and profound warmth. "I wonder where you learned to recognize that," he said. She gave him a look that was arch and affectionate in equal measure. "I had a very good teacher," she said, "one who watched." Martha Lund did indeed get the position with the Gomez Ranch, and did it extremely well, and was still there 3 years later when she married Luis Gomez in a ceremony that his parents found wonderful and slightly surprising, which was approximately the same response Theodore had received when marrying Alma, so the symmetry seemed fitting. Benjamin Walker, in the late 1880s, was growing into a young man of about 7 or 8 years old who had inherited the best of both his parents, and was deploying it with an energy that kept the household engaged. He could fix things with the steady patience of his father, and argue his position on any subject with the precision and refusal to be dismissed of his mother, and he had a particular gift with horses that suggested the Walker Ridge operation had its next generation already in training. Clara, younger and calmer, watched everything with those dark, quiet eyes and made observations that were, for a child her age, somewhat alarmingly accurate. She had decided at some point that she wanted to be a doctor, which in 1888 in Nevada was a complicated ambition for a girl, and which her parents received without dismissal, and with the practical beginning of planning for what that might require. "She'll need education beyond what the county can offer," Alma said to Theodore one evening after Clara had made this announcement with the specificity of a child who had been thinking about it for some time. "I know," Theodore said, "that's going to take resources. We'll make the resources." She looked at him. "You didn't even hesitate." "She wants to be a doctor," he said simply. "We'll find a way." Alma thought about her father who had been afraid to start. About herself, who had learned to do everything alone because dependence felt like exposure. About the 8-year-old girl she had been when her mother left, deciding that needing was dangerous. About the woman she had walked into town in October of 1878, capable and defended and deeply, privately lonely. She thought about Theodore at the desk writing down her history in his steady hand, patient and attending. She thought about the courthouse steps in October light, about the fence rail in spring evenings, about hands. She thought about asking for help and about what it had cost her to learn how. "We'll find a way," she agreed. The evening of that particular day in 1888 ended on the porch in the long western twilight, with the ridge behind them going through its famous color sequence. Amber to rose to a deep purple that faded into the deep blue of true night, and Benjamin somewhere in the barn conducting unknown experiments with the horse tack, and Clara already asleep with 3 books in her bed, and the whole territory spread out below them in the particular silence of a land that had been worked and was at rest. Alma sat with her shoulder against Theodore's, his arm around her, her hand covering his where it rested on her arm. The years had settled into them both. She was 36 now, he was 39, and the work showed in the best ways, in competence and ease and the particular grace of people who had found what they were supposed to be doing. "I've been thinking about the East Field expansion," she said. "Tell me." She told him. He listened with complete attention, as he always had, and contributed 2 ideas and a concern she hadn't considered, and by the time the stars were fully out they had a plan for the spring. She said when they were going inside, "I love this. The East Field expansion, all of it." She paused at the door, looking back at the night sky over Coffin Ridge. "I love all of it." He came to stand beside her, looking at the same sky. The stars out here were still the same extraordinary abundance of the first night she had stood and looked at them, excessive and brilliant in the dry air, with no softening humidity, burning clearly in the dark. "I know," he said quietly. She smiled. After 10 years, she still smiled at that. "Do you know what I need?" she said. "Tell me." "I need you to come inside," she said. "And I need you to stop being wise at me, at least for tonight, because I have been thinking about the East Field since breakfast and I'd like to think about something else." He laughed, and the sound of it was still the same, low and unhurried and genuinely amused, not given out lightly. She still loved it for exactly that reason. They went inside, and the door closed on the Nevada night, and the stars continued their extravagant burning above the ridge, and the land that Garrett Keene had purchased in fear, and never come to continued its patient work of being full and real, and belonging to someone who had learned, finally, that asking for what you needed was not the same as being broken. It was just being human. And being human, it turned out, with the right person beside you, watching with steady eyes and patient hands, and a love that was as solid as surveyed land, being human was more than enough. It was, in fact, the whole of everything. The morning light came across Walker's Ridge as it always did in late spring, low and gold and reaching, filling the east pasture with warmth before the heat of the day, catching the creek that ran full now along the property's edge, and making the water a moving mirror. Benjamin was already in the barn when Alma came out to the porch with her coffee, which she had long since stopped being surprised by. Clara was still asleep, which she also was not surprised by. Theodore came to stand beside her on the porch with his own cup, and they stood in the morning light without speaking, watching the property wake up. "I was thinking," she said, "about the East Field, about my father." She held her cup in both hands the way she always did in the early morning. "I think he would have liked this. All of it. He was afraid of it his whole life, but I think if he'd come, if he'd gotten here, he would have liked it." "I think so too," Theodore said. "I spent a long time being afraid of being like him, of needing too much and not having anywhere to put it. And now," she considered. The creek ran its quiet sound behind them. The light was moving across the pasture in the slow way it did when the world was in no hurry. "Now I think he was just waiting to find the right place to put it down," she said. "And he never found it, and I found it." She turned and looked at Theodore, and her expression was the open one, the one she had learned to let him see, the one that was not defended or calculated or careful, just real. "I found it because you watched, and you knew. And you waited until I could find my own way to ask." He looked at her in the morning light for a long moment. "You asked," he said. "That was always the part that mattered. I just stayed close enough to hear it when you did." She leaned up and kissed him in the morning light on the porch of the house on the ridge, with the creek running and the pasture coming alive, and the new day opening over the territory they had built together, and the whole vast, ordinary, extraordinary life of it spreading out before them, already underway, already more than enough. Benjamin's voice came from the barn at volume, announcing something about patience that required immediate parental attention, and Clara's voice came from inside the house announcing at equal volume that she was hungry and where was everyone, and the morning broke completely open around them, full and loud and irreplaceable. Alma pulled back and looked at Theodore with the smile that had taken her so long to give freely, and that she now gave without thinking about it. "Later," she said, meaning the quiet. "Later," he agreed, and they went together into the day.